You're scrolling, and a video stops you mid-swipe. Here's my exact net worth at 28. A number appears on screen, bigger than you expected. You didn't ask for this information. But now you're doing quiet math about your own life anyway. Multiply your savings, subtract your debt, compare it against a stranger you'll never actually meet. Nothing about your actual finances changed in the last 10 seconds. You just watched a stranger for 15 seconds, and somehow that was enough. And yet something in your chest just shifted. This is happening constantly right now, all over social media. It's not entirely new, but it's picked up serious momentum in the last couple of years. Younger generations especially have been pushing back against the old norm of total financial silence. People openly posting their net worth, their salary, their entire financial picture. Today I want to explain why this trend exists, and why it affects you even when you don't want it to. Not because you're insecure, but because of one very specific psychological mechanism. Let's start with how your brain actually evaluates money in the first place. There's a foundational concept in behavioral economics called reference point theory. It comes from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky from their landmark 1979 research on decision-making. That research eventually helped earn Kahneman a Nobel Prize in economics decades later. Their finding was simple, but it changes everything about how we experience wealth. People don't judge money in absolute terms. They judge it relative to a reference point, a baseline they're comparing against. The same 50,000 can feel great or terrible, depending entirely on what you're measuring it against. To someone who grew up with very little, it can feel like genuine security. To someone who just watched a stranger's video claiming triple that amount, it can feel disappointing. Here's where it gets interesting. That reference point isn't fixed. It shifts constantly, based on whatever information you were just exposed to. Scroll past someone's net worth reveal, and for a moment, that becomes your new baseline. Your own situation hasn't moved an inch. Your salary is the same, your savings account has the exact same balance it did 5 minutes ago. But it suddenly feels smaller, simply because the comparison point just changed. There's an older concept that explains why this specific comparison happens so easily. Psychologist Leon Festinger proposed social comparison theory back in 1954. It's one of the most cited ideas in social psychology, still referenced constantly today. His core idea was that people evaluate themselves by comparing to others, especially with no objective standard. Money is a perfect example of an ambiguous domain. There's no universal finish line, no single number that means you've won. So people instinctively look outward for a benchmark, and social media hands them one constantly. In the past, that benchmark came from people physically around you, neighbors, co-workers, family. Now it comes from an algorithm capable of showing you literally anyone on the planet. There's also something worth understanding about what actually shows up in your feed. Extreme numbers get shared, and extreme numbers get boosted, far more than typical ones. You're not seeing a random sample of real people's finances. You're seeing a heavily skewed highlight reel, mostly outliers on the high end. The platform isn't trying to mislead you specifically, it's just optimizing for what gets watched longest. Every time you see one, your reference point quietly resets toward that outlier. This happens without you ever consciously deciding to compare yourself to anyone. Financial commentators have started calling this pattern money dysmorphia, a distorted sense of your own standing. It's not a clinical diagnosis, but it captures something real about how comparison can warp self-perception. The comparison is baked into the simple act of scrolling past the video. Now let me tell you about a Tuesday night that got away from me a little. I opened social media just to unwind, nothing serious in mind. Within 10 minutes, I'd seen 3 different net worth reveal videos in a row. By the 4th one, I was doing math in my head about decisions I made years ago. Should I have taken that job, invested earlier, spent less on that one big purchase? None of that math was useful. It was just quiet, anxious comparison. I closed the app feeling worse about my own finances than I had an hour earlier. Nothing about my actual situation had changed the entire time. That's when I built a small mental framework for catching this in the moment. First, notice the reference point shift happening in real time. Just naming it, my baseline just moved because of a video, takes away some of its power. Second, ask for the missing context out loud, even if the video never provides it. Something as simple as, I don't actually know this person's full story, resets the comparison instantly. What's their age, their city, their industry, their family situation? Net worth without context is just a number floating with no anchor. A 22-year-old with family money and a 45-year-old who built everything alone aren't comparable. Third, deliberately return to your own baseline. Compare this month to your own last month, not to a stranger's highlight reel. Fourth, curate what you're actually exposed to. If a certain type of content consistently drags your mood down, muting it isn't weakness. It's just reference point management, the same thing advertisers do to you on purpose. Since doing this, those videos barely register with me anymore. I can watch one, feel nothing shift, and keep scrolling. Here's a mistake I made early on, trying to fix this the wrong way. I tried to avoid all financial content completely for a while. That backfired, because it just made me less informed, not less anxious. Cutting myself off didn't make the comparison instinct disappear, it just removed anything useful alongside it. The fix isn't avoidance, it's context. Now let's clear up a myth that comes up constantly around this trend. A lot of people assume anyone posting their net worth is either flexing or lying. On the surface, that's a fair assumption, given how much fake wealth content exists online. Plenty of that older content really was about status, curated to look more impressive than reality. But here's the twist that research and reporting on this trend actually points to. Surveys on money conversations consistently find that finances remain one of the most avoided topics in America. Financial psychologists have long documented this pattern of money secrecy passed down across generations. Many people involved in this specific trend describe a different motivation entirely. Some cite growing up in households where money was never discussed at all, even in emergencies. Posting publicly for them is a reaction against that inherited silence, not an extension of old flexing. The goal, at least for many creators, is normalizing money talk, not showing off. Salary transparency movements, for comparison, have documented real benefits. Research on pay transparency has linked it to better negotiation outcomes and reduced unfair pay gaps. Companies and even entire states have adopted salary range disclosure laws for exactly this reason. So the myth isn't completely wrong. Some of this content genuinely is about status. But the myth misses that transparency itself can be a separate, legitimate motivation. Both things can be true about the exact same piece of content, depending entirely on who's watching. The same video can be helpful information for one viewer and harmful comparison fuel for another. It depends less on the poster's intent and more on how you personally engage with it. That distinction puts more control back in your hands than you might expect. Let me paint two different outcomes from the exact same kind of video. Person 1 sees a stranger's net worth, learns a rough industry benchmark they didn't have before. They use that information to ask for a raise with more confidence. Without that video, they might have stayed underpaid simply from not knowing what to ask for. Person 2 sees the same kind of video and spirals into comparison for the rest of the day. Same content, same platform, completely different result. Neither person did anything wrong by watching. The outcome diverged somewhere else entirely. The difference wasn't the video. It was whether they extracted context and moved on, or absorbed the number as their new baseline. So here's what I'd actually suggest. Next time this content shows up in your feed, ask what information is actually missing before reacting to the number itself. Decide, on purpose, whether this is useful benchmarking or just comparison bait today. If it's useful, take the information and move on. If it's not, you're allowed to scroll past without absorbing it as your new reference point. You get to decide what data is useful to you and what's just noise dressed up as information. None of this means the trend is good or bad across the board. It just means your reaction to it is something you actually have some control over. If this helped you understand your own reaction to this kind of content, that's what this channel is for. Every week I break down the psychology behind money and social media that quietly shapes how we feel. Subscribe if you want more of this. And tell me in the comments, has a net worth video ever changed your mood without you realizing why? I'd genuinely like to know how common that actually is. Even just naming the feeling out loud tends to take some of its power away. See you in the next one.